Hello and welcome to lesson zero. I'm going to be talking through your note taking from the Transatlantic Slavery and Its Legacies textbook that was provided with some guiding questions for your taking of notes. This is really an attempt not for you to remember every single thing you read here, but just to build up some of that knowledge and that sense of the period that we're going to be kind of constructing over the next few lessons. So please do give it your best, make sure you focused, and we're going to go and begin. There are three chapters here, three sections that we're going to be referring to a lot of the periods, but these are broken down into enslavement, abolition, and legacies. So, section one, or chapter one, enslavement, Africa before transatlantic slavery. And there's a lot to read here, really important stuff, interesting stuff, some stuff that might build on what you learned, hopefully at Key Stage 3. But the questions: why do Europeans know so little of African history? Well, I think that also links to question two: what purpose did this ignorance serve? Well, it certainly served a purpose in the 19th century when European colonizers wanted to justify their expropriation of land and wealth and resources from African peoples. So to deny a history that existed before the European presence was very convenient to talk and then allow justify as the famous author of Jungle Book and his well, let's say poet Rudyard Kipling put it, to take up the quote unquote white man's burden, that burden to govern, to civilize, to rule over the black peoples of Africa. Now that served a real purpose. We know actually that little was known, partly because little was looked for, but it was there, this history of pre-colonial, as it's referred to, Africa. Question two, development of transatlantic slavery. Well, you've got bits to read here and you've got three questions. How does slavery always dehumanize? Well, it reduces a person to a commodity. Who began the practice of Europeans buying enslaved African people? Well, the Portuguese were responsible for this, but very soon followed by other European nations. But this was originally done on very small scales. Okay, and we're nowhere near the numbers we're talking about by the times of the late 18th century that we'll be studying. Who began the practice? We've said. Who started taking them over to the Americas? Well, again, the Spanish, Portuguese, followed by British, French, Dutch, Danish as well, but white European countries, or European countries, I should say, as I will mention later. This concept of white only really emerges as slavery develops. So Britain and North America. Well, the Americas refer to all of this supposedly new world. And remember that phrase "new world" refers to a new place for Europeans to find. We know, and we must not forget, that this was not a new world for those that lived there, the thousands, the millions that lived in the American continent. So whether in North, Central, or South, and even the name America is named after an explorer who, quote unquote, found America, or these islands, and was, his name was Amerigo, so they took the name America from that. But the Americas, Britain and North America. What was the difference between the indentured servants and enslaved persons in North America? Well, indentured servants were predominantly Europeans who were brought over and had a certain period to work. But after that period, they would be free and they'd be allowed, have the same legal rights as any other free person. Enslaved persons were people that were enslaved for the whole of their life, and as soon develops in the 1500s and 1600s, that they are not only enslaved for their whole lives, but their sons and daughters and their children are also enslaved. And this becomes the system of what we come to know as transatlantic slavery. Why did it's also referred to in some cases as chattel slavery, because they're treated almost as if they're animals that are owned and inherited and passed on, and their sons and daughters are passed on as well. They are commodified. Why did British plantation owners move away from indentured labour and towards enslaved workers? Well, they moved away partly for this, partly because of the solidarity that was being built between these enslaved workers and indentured labourers in situations such as uprisings against plantation owners, they decided that actually using enslaved workers and giving rights to indentured labourers was a sensible move, because it created this kind of class of people, white European class of people, um, who were in some sense more loyal to the system of plantation labour. So that was one of the reasons why. The other reasons was, of course, that enslaved workers were overall, and there's a bit of historical debate about this, but overall were far more profitable to be using and exploiting on your plantations, and particularly for the production of that golden product of the 18th and 19th century, but particularly of the 18th century, sugar. Sugar, as you may have read in your Hochschild chapter, hopefully you have, on the process of producing it, is a painstaking and brutal process to produce. So that sweetness in your tea comes from a brutal, brutal, sour work that is done in terrible conditions to boil the sugar, and it still is today, to be fair. But it was done in a very intense way, and to do this, you required workers who would work very hard, and you'd require workers who would work very long for certain hours of particular moments of the year, and that, therefore, was the kind of thing that enslaved workers were more profitable to use for. So this is part of the reason why there's a development in, or expansion, acceleration in the trafficking, enslavement, and kidnapping of West Africans, taking them over to places like Jamaica and the Americas to produce sugar. The Caribbean. Now, most people, when they think of slavery in this country, partly because of the context in which we live, where America is so dominant, think of North America. But actually, the vast majority, as you may well know, go to the Caribbean. Vast majority of British, should I say, enslaved people, or people enslaved and then used by the British. The vast majority of enslaved people actually end up going to Brazil, and that's a whole different story. But we're talking here about the British colonies, and the vast majority of enslaved people that go anywhere in the British colonies go to the Caribbean. And which island is it that they go to? The vast majority of those go to Jamaica. So by the end of the 17th century, what was the most profitable crop in the Caribbean? I've mentioned this. Sugar was becoming profitable, and it had been taken over from other parts of the world, actually parts of the Mediterranean, and it was now being able to be grown in the Caribbean. What were the Navigation Acts, and what did they do? Well, the Navigation Acts, should I say it properly, the Navigation Acts were an imperial tool, a way to defend your market against foreign traders, and this is what we refer to as mercantilism. Mercantilism. It's a very important word that we're going to come back to. It's in your glossary if you check it when you get it. It is the concept that you defend your country's trading, and therefore you make it illegal or very expensive for your country to trade with others, and for your people to trade with other countries. So you try and keep the wealth in your empire. It's what we sometimes refer to today as protectionism, but mercantilism. And the Navigation Acts were acts of Parliament that enforced such behaviour and such regulation. Britain and Africa. Well, what were Britain doing in Africa? What kicked off mass exploitation of West Africa by the British? Again, lots of historical debate around this, but if you do your reading in the textbook, you'll see that the Royal Africa Company, the Royal Africa Company that at some point, by the way, was headed by a man named John Cass. Does that sound familiar? Yes, John Cass, the same John Cass that the school in Bow is named after. Sir John Cass was one of the chairs of, or chiefs of, the Royal Africa Company, whose role was to go to Africa, buy enslaved people, and sell them to whoever. And the Royal African Company set out to supply 5,600 slaves, or enslaved people, sorry, to the Caribbean and Virgin colonies, as well as trading goods. But this expanded in the 1680s, 1690s. By the way, also one of the people involved in this was a young young James, shall I say, Duke of York, who was a governor of the company. He was to become James II. The royal family were heavily involved in this in the 1680s, and this is the alternative history of the 1680s, the non-glorious revolution history of the 1680s, and we can see here the far from glorious history of the British monarchy at this period, investing, developing, growing this Atlantic slave trade. Um, so what was the purpose of the Royal African Company? We've said after 1712 the slave trade expanded. Why? Well, after 1712 all slave trading with Africa was free trade, so there was no mercantilist policy on this. You could buy and sell enslaved peoples, and you could sell them to whoever you wanted to if you were a British slave trader. So lots of British slave traders went and kidnapped, stole people, brutalized them, and sold them to any and every buyer who was willing to buy them. And so that ultimately led to British people becoming very wealthy, British slave traders becoming very wealthy. London, sugar and slavery. So section 6, we answer questions. What drove the expansion of transatlantic slavery? Well, sugar, profit. What impact did this have on London? Well, London became far wealthier. Lots of this wealth found its way into London. And remember, this is something worth bearing in mind. We're going to look at a lot in lesson 4. It's not just about buying and selling enslaved people, but everything that comes out of this industry is profitable because you've got people that you've stolen and you're forcing to work for free. So during this time, we see the development not only of people making money out of buying and selling people, but also people making out money of buying and selling things associated with that process of buying and selling people. Now, if that was confusing, it's because it is. But this is a system of what we refer to as slavery or slave capitalism or racialized capitalism, where effectively what we've got here is we've got an economy based off the right of Europeans to steal people and force them to work for them. And these people being obviously enslaved West Africans. So what does that mean? We see insurance industries growing up. We see absentee plantation owners, people who nominally are owners of a plantation, owners of people in the Caribbean who've been trafficked, and yet they never go there. Their money is coming in almost like it's a kind of investment that today you might see people making investments online. This is investments that people had, and this money was finding its way into London society. People were using that profit to buy things, to invest in things. So London expands during this period, and people associated with those industries expand with it. Who are the absentees? I've kind of addressed it. In their status in British society, well, originally looked down upon a bit, but they became so wealthy that their role in British society grew and grew. And by the 18th century, by the time we're studying, they are effectively part of that ruling class. So when we talk about this period in English history, we sometimes call it the aristocratic period or the period of aristocracy. If you learn if you did your study of the Glorious Revolution, you'll know that the aristocracy are those who replace a king, James II, with another king and queen, William and Mary. And they are effectively the ruling class of Britain. Now, they're the ruling class because they're so powerful, and they're so powerful partly because of these industries, and particularly this industry of enslavement that is making them shed loads of money. Okay, and so we know, therefore, that the history of the 18th century is a history partly of money, wealth, power built upon the enslavement of peoples and the miseries of peoples. And this brings us to the middle passage questions, because the middle passage here we've talked about, you may have heard about, is a horrific passage between West Africa and the Americas, which led to over 2 million people dying along the way through poor sanitary conditions, being thrown overboard, rebellions and revolts on the way, being quashed. So how many people were enslaved during the transatlantic slave trade? Well, we have estimates here, yeah. We say that roughly about 12 million. And you'll see a map on this in lesson 1. But how many died in the middle passage and why? Well, we know that roughly 2 million died along that middle passage journey, which is a horrific number of people who died having been enslaved, never even reaching the new world and the misery that would bring. As a kind of side note, is a very, very, very beautiful monument in the Caribbean to those who died along the way, which is on the seabed, which you can visit in snorkeling, but it is a beautiful monument. There's also actually a reference to it in Black Panther, the movie, at the end, where our villain, so to speak, speaks of all the enslaved peoples that have been taken and have basically died along the seabed. Horrific idea, horrific reality for millions of people who were taken and dumped in the sea. and many of them were, by the way, even if they got ill, they were thrown overboard. And scholars have written and researched this. Um, Marcus Rediker being one of the notable ones who wrote a book on the slave ship, which I gave you an introductory chapter to. Why did some refer to it as the triangular trade? Well, this idea of the triangular trade, which we're going to move away from because historians really have now, but it's referred to as the triangular trade, partly because it was a very, euphemistic term. It was embarrassing to refer to the enslavement of people. We shouldn't pretend that even back in the 18th and 19th century, people just thought this was fine. They didn't. So the triangular trade was a euphemistic term, but it was a euphemistic term that applied to the idea that trade would occur between peoples and then between goods. So ships would sail out from Bristol, Liverpool, and London primarily. Vast majority going from Liverpool, by the way, or being built in Liverpool, but many came from London and Bristol as well as other European ports. And they would go to West Africa and they would basically trade items for people. They would give over things like guns, alcohol, and sometimes currencies for peoples that would then be taken to the New World. They would there be sold again, probably to a slave owner who'd seek to buy them for their plantation. And in return, they'd receive money that they'd then take back or goods that they'd take back to Britain. And this was supposed to be a triangular thing. In reality, we actually want to see this more as a core and a periphery model, and we're going to look at that world systems theory when we get to lesson 4. But that makes more sense, and it's it's where the scholarship is at now. When we look at this particular period of history, the triangular trade, it didn't really work like that, and economic historians have made that argument. We're going to look at why. Conditions on the plantations were poor. Obviously, we've got the slave codes. They were horrific, and the slave codes set out what rights the slave owners had over their quote-unquote chattel, their property, those people that they enslaved. And it was known as chattel because, as we said, you had a right, almost like you had the right over animals, and that, the horrific nature of that and everything that entailed in terms of the treatment and abuse. What did work look like? Well, work looked different to different people who were enslaved, and we must say there was no one typical slave or enslaved experience. So reading through that, you'll see ideas of provision grounds, ideas of urban versus plantation slavery. What was it like for the cultural and social life of the people in the Caribbean and places like Jamaica? Well, the term Creole refers specifically to people who, were mixtures of cultures from different parts of the world. And we can see here the Creole today refers primarily to people who have a kind of Caribbean African culture, or Afro-Caribbean culture. It's a mixture of two. So that term is used sometimes. Religion, the role of religion in this whole period is a very ambivalent one. It's got both positive and negative effects upon slavery. It promotes it. Particularly like the Codrington estate, was an estate owned by the Church of England, and run by people who worked for the Church of England, and the profit made off it by the enslaved people was taken by the Church of England. These were people who were stamped with the initials of the Church of England on them. So we have here some religion, or some elements of religion, being, fully supportive of slavery. But we also have elements of religion that were critical. The Quakers were very critical from the beginning of enslavement. And if you're interested in that, researching a man named Benjamin Lay, I tell you what, you will have a very fun time. An amazing man to research. But also, we see the role of Baptist religion and the role of this idea of almost a kind of revolutionary religion that emerges with figures like Sam Sharp that we're going to look at, who were Baptists who preached the word of God as a justification for emancipation. So religion has an ambivalent role in this. Enslaved families. Again, family life was very difficult for enslaved people, part of the kind of horror of being enslaved. And the nature of family changed during the period. Being mixed heritage, or just because you had a white parent, and this was quite common, sadly, in the Caribbean because of the use of sexual assault and rape by enslavers. It was quite common, and this is one of the really interesting and equally horrific things about slavery, was that there was a kind of sexualization of the same people that were being enslaved. So black men and black women particularly were seen as sexual objects at the same time as being seen as lesser than human. And so what we see is a lot of slave masters. One particular classic and notorious example is the man Thomas Thistlewood. We may come to see a Jamaican slave plantation owner um, who, regularly sexually assaulted um, the people that he claimed ownership over, and fathered many children. But the interesting and, like I say, horrific thing about it is that the kids and the young people who were produced by that sexual assault, if they had a white father but a black mother, would still be considered as a black person. And this is sometimes in America what's referred to as the one drop rule. The idea that, one drop of supposedly black blood would make you a black person, but, you know, one drop of white blood would not make you a white person. I mean, we know that blood is not, it doesn't work like that. We all bleed the same. But these concepts were very important. And why do you think that that was so important to the legal system? Well, let's just think about that. If you ensure that there is a majority of black population, where you ensure that the produce, so to speak, the progeny, the children of your enslaved people were also black or classified as black, then you were able to enslave them as well. And this is part of the system of race that is set up during slavery that we're still dealing with today, because that system was a material system. It guaranteed wealth for certain people. And so the system reproduces a certain way of thinking that says that black people are people with any black inheritance, any black relative, because that that's profitable because you manage to keep more people under your enslavement. Okay, and that's something that I think helps us to think about how the legacies of slavery are still with us today, because our understandings of what it means to be black, what it means to be white, which again, like I say, have no biological basis, um, but do have a historical basis, and that historical basis is um, based in a material need, a profitability. And this is what we will refer to sometimes as the material understandings of race. But like I said, we'll look at that far more in lesson 7. Lesson 7. So, chapter 2, abolition, the campaign to change. Abolition is something we know about, the abolition of slavery, the abolition of the slave trade. It's quite well known about in Britain. It's something that Britain takes a lot of pride in because it saw itself as being important in ending the slave trade, as well as, of course, also beginning it. And there's a very famous quote by a historian called Eric Williams who effectively said something to the words of, "It's almost as if the British invented slavery in order to abolish it." The argument being that effectively they laud themselves for abolishing slavery, but really don't consider the fact that it was them that started it, or at least industrialized it in the first place. So, what was different between the 1807 campaign and the 1833 campaign? Well, it's worth saying that 1807 abolished the slave trade. The 1833 campaign that eventually succeeded, by the way, that was abolishing the slave trade in the British Empire. The 1833 campaign abolished abolished enslavement and the system of slave plantations and the enslavement of peoples and the British Empire in 1833. However, it delayed it for 5 years, and we're going to look at that in lots of detail. It also paid out millions to the slave owners. Again, we're going to look at that in compensation. So who were the original abolitionists and what did they resist? Well, the original abolitionists, it's worth saying, were the enslaved people themselves. The original abolitionists were the enslaved people themselves because no one wants to be enslaved. So it's worth remembering as a historian that just because these people were referred to as slaves doesn't mean that they're not people. We need to see them as people, and that's why we use the term enslaved person. We try to remember that these people are people with intentions, with incentives, with love, with family, with all of these things. And so therefore, they were the original abolitionists because they did not want to be enslaved. However, the term abolitionism is something that's taken up politically by people, particularly in Britain, in the late 18th century. And the original abolitionists were people like Thomas Clarkson, people like William Wilberforce, people like Granville Sharp, and we're going to learn a lot about them. And they eventually campaigned for the abolition of the slave trade, which does happen in 1807. The later campaign is about the abolition of slavery, and that again takes a while, and there are a lot of caveats to that, and the legacy of that we're going to look at in lots of detail, as I've said. So formerly enslaved people who campaigned, there are lots of examples of them. I'm not going to go through the answers to these because I think you can do that, but these stories are very interesting. We're going to look particularly at the James Somerset case in a more detail. Jonathan Strong case we don't touch upon, but I do say is a very interesting case, and it's great because these are cases of actually enslaved people who emancipated themselves or found emancipation, fought for emancipation, and campaigned on it. They were abolitionists. It's worth considering them as abolitionists. They called themselves abolitionists, and they were super important in that fight. And each of their stories is revealing for us as historians. But there were also British abolitionists, the Quakers. Granville Sharp mentioned, not a Quaker himself, but closely associated with him, William Wilberforce and Thomas Clarkson. And again, I'm not going to go through the answers on these, but you can read through them and tell us what does it reveal about slavery at the time. There were lots of uprisings. We're going to look at Tacky's War. We're going to look at the Haitian Revolution as an impact on Jamaica, but we're also going to look at the Baptist War, which ends slavery or brings about the end of slavery in 1831-32. Of course, our focus is on Jamaica. Amelioration is a particular period. Amelioration means improvement, and that's a particular period in British Jamaican relations or in Caribbean history. We're going to look at, because this is a period where the British claim they are improving the conditions of the enslaved people, and this comes after the end of the slave trade, and it comes partly because the plantation owners, who are still politically very powerful, are worried that slavery will end, and so they're looking for justification to keep it going, and so they bring in, or they support or allow the bringing in of these, sometimes referred to as the Canning Resolutions, improvement in the conditions. And here are some of the regulations that are put in place. We know from historians' accounts, or shall I say from missionaries' accounts who go out there and write records, that these aren't applied that evenly, and they are very half measures. They do not emancipate, and it doesn't work eventually, because the slave owners eventually are forced to give up the slave system, and their enslaved people were emancipated. So this is a period we refer in history called the period of amelioration, the improvement, supposedly. So this brings us to the final chapter, chapter 3, legacies. Legacy means the leftovers, or the impact, or the kind of carry on of a particular thing. And we talk a lot about the legacies of slavery because they are still with us today, and it's one of the reasons why it's a significant thing to study. An important thing to study. So the abolition of slavery and compensation is one of the lesser known stories, compensation, but is becoming more and more known. It's becoming more and more known partly because of a brilliant study project done by historians like Nicholas Draper, Katie Donington, Catherine Hall, run out of the UCL Legacies of British Slave Trade Institute, who have digitized the records of those who at the moment of emancipation said, okay, we're getting rid of our enslaved peoples, we're emancipating them, that's our property, so you, British government, you need to give us money for it. And they were given £20 million in those days, which today would be an unprecedented amount. I think it's kind of an equivalent to what we paid out during the 2008 financial crisis to bail out banks. In fact, the actual money that the British government borrowed to pay this out to the former slave owners as compensation was only fully paid off in the 2000s, because we paid so much interest on it. So it's worth bearing in mind this was a huge amount of money paid out. And some of the estimates are done here. It's very interesting research done by, like I say, that institute. But what we would say is these records were firstly show us the power of the slave owners at the time as a lobby to campaign for this amount of money, but also they're revealing to us because it does reveal to us how many British people owned enslaved people at that time and how many they owned. Okay, so there's quite a good source of record. Now it does tell us a lot about the system of slavery upon its ending, because people claim they own this amount of money, and some of those people who claim actually end up not getting the money because the government decides that it's not a fair claim. But many more do get paid out, and some of that wealth is still in the British economy today. So it's notable, for instance, that David Cameron is one example of someone whose relatives claimed and received lots of money for emancipation. Uh, this is some pretty important stuff for British history, and also worth noting that the irony of the fact that after this horror of enslavement, and it's universally accepted today, and even back then it was accepted by a lot of people that this system was a horrific system, and yet the compensation is being paid to the slave owners, not the enslaved. Um, but what are the limitations of this as a source of record, as a source, as evidence of the period? Well, they don't, by telling us the records of the amount of people who were owned by a particular person, they don't tell us the experiences of those particular people. And we need to look deeper, we need to look harder, and sometimes we need to look more creatively to find out the experiences of the enslaved themselves. So these records don't allow us to see those particular stories. Apprenticeship. What was apprenticeship? Well, apprenticeship was a system put in place basically to delay the ending of slavery. So after 1833, slavery was ended, but we had this delay because the slave owners are powerful enough to say to Parliament, okay, we'll get rid of slavery, but you need to give us some time to prepare for this. And to prepare for this, you need to give us 5 years. So what we're going to do is we're going to end slavery, but we're going to put in this system of apprenticeships, which basically means you're going to have to work, if you're an enslaved person, to work off the debt that you owe us. Because you owe us money now because we are now letting you free. So a lot of people were forced to work for nominally it was supposed to be 6 years, but it ended up being only 5 years, from 1833 to 1838, on the same plantations that they had been enslaved upon. So this was a system that was effectively just as bad as the slavery system that it was supposedly replacing. And many abolitionists at the time, as well as many enslaved people who'd been, or apprentices as they became, campaigned against this. And we can look at that in a bit more detail in later lessons. And this brings us finally to this question of what the Caribbean was like after 1833. Now, this is a really big question. This is one of the questions that we're going to be looking at in our study, because in the common understanding, slavery ends and people are free. However, we know at the time that the conditions of being a black Jamaican after emancipation were far from being sufficient. In fact, actually, there are some historians who argue that there is a continuity that exists, that the conditions of those who were formerly enslaved was just as bad. And there's historians like Thomas Holt, particularly, we can think of also historians like Eric Williams, and as well Hilary Beckles, who have argued effectively that there was a continuity in the conditions of lives of those black Jamaicans who had been enslaved. So some argue that not much changes after 1833. We also see a real fear from the planters, who think, oh my word, we've now got no power to enforce labour discipline. These black workers that we've kidnapped, taken over, and forced to work on our plantation and treated so badly, how are we going to make sure they turn up to work on Monday morning? The island's big enough, they can just go and find their own plot and grow their own fruit and vegetables and food and find enough food to live. Why would they work for us? And so what they do is they create a system that enforces basically a labour discipline upon people. And we're going to look at that in more detail. But what that means is you cannot work you cannot be absent from work. You cannot be a quote unquote vagrant, and there are some laws that are passed to enforce this. So effectively, many black Jamaicans at that time, are forced to return to the plantations that they had supposedly been emancipated from, and then supposedly been apprentices on. They're forced to return, and that's one of the cruel ironies and the horrifying realities of Jamaica after 1833. And historians have made this argument partly because on the basis of the sources and then available to us, because we've now got newly freed Jamaicans who are now writing about their experiences, and this comes to a kind of a head in the Morant Bay War, which is a moment in 1865 that is the other bookend of our course. The first being the 1760 Tacky Taki's revolt or Taki's war. We see in 1865 another uprising, an uprising about, again, the conditions, the horrors of life working and living in Jamaica under a planter class. And that is really revealing to us about the conditions of life there. So I'm going to leave that there now. We've gone through a lot of it. Like I said, you don't need to remember everything you've read and written notes on. But for now, just get as much as you can down, and we'll start lesson 1 soon. Bye.